Medieval philosophy. In the year 313 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine was converted to Christianity. And even though only 1 in 10 citizens of the empire was a Christian, Christianity became the official religion of the realm. During the next couple of centuries, the early church fathers turned to the prevailing Neoplatonic philosophical tradition in their search for intellectual foundations for their still relatively new religion. The first truly important philosopher in this Christian Platonic tradition was Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430. He had one foot squarely planted in the classical world and one in the medieval world, and he straddled the abyss which separated these two worlds. As a young student of rhetoric in Rome, acutely aware of his own sensual nature, Augustine was concerned with the problem of good and evil. He became attracted to Manichaeism, founded by Mani of Persia in the 3rd century, which, combining certain Christian and Persian elements, was a philosophy which understood reality in terms of an eternal struggle between the principle of light, good, and the principle of darkness, evil. The strife between these two principles manifested itself as the world. The soul represented the good and the body represented evil. And as a Manichae, Augustine could attribute his many sins to principles somehow outside himself. But Augustine soon became dissatisfied with this solution to the problem of evil, and he became attracted to Neoplatonism and its conception of an immaterial reality. It was from Neoplatonism that Augustine got his idea of evil not as a real feature of reality, but as a lack, an incompleteness, a privation. Recall the simile of the line, the more goodness a thing has, the more real it is. Conversely, the less reality it has, the worse it is. Just as a dental cavity is a lack of calcium, a hole is not a thing, it is an absence of being, so is a sin not a thing, but an absence of goodness. In 388, after a minor mystical experience, Augustine converted to Christianity and never again vacillated in his intellectual commitment. In 391, he was ordained priest, and in 396 became the Bishop of Hippo on the North African coast. During this period, Christianity was still seeking to achieve focus on its own identity. And Augustine spent an enormous amount of energy combating a series of heresies: Donatism, Priscillianism, Arianism, and of course, that of his former persuasion, Manichaeism. But at the same time, he had to combat a new and especially difficult heresy, that of Pelagianism. Pelagius' heresy was that of over-accentuating the role of free will in salvation and minimizing the role of God's grace. Much to Augustine's embarrassment, Pelagius had been using Augustine's book on free will to defend his own view. Does God's foreknowledge determine our actions? So Augustine found himself walking a tightrope. He had to attack the Manichaeans for minimizing free will and attack the Pelagians for overemphasizing it. This problem occupied him in some very subtle philosophical reasoning. The problem: if God is all-wise, omniscient, then he knows the future. If he knows the future, then the future must unfold exactly in accordance with his knowledge. Otherwise, he does not know the future. If the events in the future must occur according to God's foreknowledge of them, then they are necessary and there is no freedom. If there is no freedom, then humans are not responsible for their acts, in which case it would be immoral to punish people for their sins. If God knew millions of years before Judas was born that he would betray Jesus, how could God send Judas to hell for his sin? So the conclusion seems to be either God is omniscient but immoral, or he is benevolent but ignorant. How can Augustine avoid this unpalatable dilemma? He does so with a number of sophisticated arguments. One is that for God there is no past or future, only an eternal present. For him, everything happens at once. To say God knew millions of years before Judas' birth that he would betray Jesus is to make the human error of believing that God is in time. In fact, God is outside of time. That's what it means to say that God is eternal. Another tack of Augustine's is to admit that God's knowledge of the world entails necessity. but to deny that necessity is incompatible with freedom. Like the Stoics, Augustine believed that freedom is the capacity of doing what one wants, and one can do what one wants even if God or anyone else already knows what that person wants. Augustine pointed out that God's foreknowledge of a decision doesn't cause the decision any more than my own acts are caused by my knowledge of what I'm going to do. This is a sample of Augustinian thought. His philosophy is a profound meditation on the relation between God and the human being. It was addressed to a troubled and expiring world. The old order was crumbling. In fact, on the same day, Augustine succumbed to the infirmities of old age in the cathedral at Hippo. The barbaric Vandals were burning the city. Even though they left the cathedral standing out of respect for him, the fires that consumed Hippo were the same ones which consumed the Roman Empire. The classical period was over, and that long night which some call the Dark Ages had commenced. At the death of Augustine, Western philosophy fell into a state of deterioration which was to last for 400 years. This period, the advent of the medieval world, truly was the dark night of the Western soul. The Roman legions could no longer control the frontiers of the empire, and the Teutonic tribes from the eastern forest swarmed over the old empire. Rome was sacked twice within a 35-year period. The new barbarian emperors no longer bore Latin names, but Germanic ones. They were not interested in culture as it had been known in classical times. Philosophy, as the Greeks and Romans had understood it, was in danger of perishing. During this long, dark night, philosophy flickered only as individual candle flames at distant corners of the old dead empire. Certain isolated monasteries in Italy, Spain, Britain, and on the rocky crags of islands in the Irish Sea produced what are known as the encyclopedists, who systematically compiled and conserved whatever remnants of classical wisdom they could lay their hands on. The three salient figures in this tradition are Boethius, 480 to 425 in Italy, Isidore, 570 to 636 in Spain, and the Venerable Bede, 674 to 735 in England. St. Isidore's encyclopedia is particularly revealing. Under the letter A, we find both an entry on the atomic theory and an entry on the antipodes, the people who were supposed to inhabit the rocky plains of southern Africa and who Isidore believed had their big toes on the outside of the feet, thereby allowing them more maneuverability among the rocky fields where they dwelt. Isidore's hodgepodge is emblematic of the state of philosophy during the Dark Ages. Suddenly, after 4 centuries of relative silence, philosophy blossomed forth in the work of the first great metaphysical system builder of the Middle Ages, the redundantly named John Scotus Erigena, John the Irishman, circa 810 to 870. John had been called from Ireland to the Palatine school of King Charles the Bald to translate the Greek document known today as the Pseudo-Dionysius, a work falsely believed to have been written by St. Paul's Christian convert, St. Dionysius, but believed today to have been written by a Neoplatonic philosopher unsympathetic to Christianity. Erigena's own book on the divisions of nature was greatly influenced by his reading of the Pseudo-Dionysius and is a confusing combination of Christian dogma and Neoplatonic pantheism. Through his book and his influential translation, Platonism gained an even greater foothold in Christianity. John's goal was the categorization and understanding of the totality of reality, what he calls nature. The first categorical distinction he drew was between things that are and things that are not. This distinction involves the Platonic supposition that there is a hierarchy of being, that some things are more real than other things. Things that are not are those entities which on a Neoplatonic scale contain a lesser degree of reality. For example, a particular tree or horse contains less being than the form tree or the form horse. Hence, particulars are subsumed under this negative category. So are all lacks or deprivations, such as sinful acts or acts of forgetting. The most surprising thing we find in this category is what John called super-reality, that which cannot be grasped by the human intellect, that which on the Neoplatonic scale is beyond being. Apparently, John was talking about God. What is left? What can be called the things that are? Only those entities which can be comprehended by pure human intellect, namely the Platonic forms. All else is other than being. So we find this Christian scholar in the apparently awkward position of claiming that God is among those things classified as non-existent. In the same class where you would expect to find mountains made of gold, centaurs, griffins, and round squares. So why doesn't this end all discussion of God once and for all? Because John's method of the vias affirmativa and negativa, borrowed from the pseudo-Dionysius, allowed him to make sense of the nothingness of a being beyond being. Via affirmativa, we affirm God is wise. This affirmation is true only as metaphor. Wisdom is a word which gets its meaning from human discourse, which we can apply to God only analogically to give us a hint of his nature. Via negativa, we deny the affirmation, God is not wise. This negation is literal because wisdom gets its meaning from human discourse. It cannot literally apply to God. This affirmation and its negation do not lead to a self-contradiction. Rather, they serve as thesis and antithesis, and are dialectically reconciled in a Hegelian-like synthesis, which will lead us to realize that God is somehow superwise. The same method will show us why John said that God does not exist, but that he super-exists. There is yet another way in which John Scotish Erigena divided nature. 1. Nature that creates and is uncreated. 2. Nature that creates and is created. 3. Nature that is created and does not create. 4. Nature that is not created and does not create. Number 1, God. Number 2, the Platonic forms. Number 3, the physical world. Number 4, God. Remember, in this Neoplatonic schema, to say that something X creates is to say that there is something below X in the hierarchy of reality which is dependent upon X. Conversely, to say that something Y is created is to say that Y is dependent on something above it for its existence. In this system, God is both Alpha and Omega, beginning and end, creator and goal of creation. God issues out into the world and comes back to himself. All this looks suspiciously like Plotinus' pantheistic system of emanations. And though many attempts were made to defend the divisions of nature against the charge of heresy, eventually it was condemned as heterodoxical in 1225 by Pope Honorius III.